presentation on Catherine de' Medici, who served as Queen of France in the 1500s. Let's get into it. The Wicked Queen. As I mentioned previously, Catherine de' Medici served as Queen of France in the 1500s, specifically from 1547 to 1589. She was one of the most powerful women in Europe at the time. She ruled during a period of religious conflict in France, where political machinations had split the French nobility into Protestant, also known as Huguenot, and Catholic sects. During her reign, the French government was split apart by intense political factionalism that would eventually devolve into violence, as we shall soon see. Historical sources often depict her as a scheming and evil queen who committed heinous acts to protect her control over France and the rule of her sons. However, the actual historical picture is a lot more complicated than that, and Catherine de' Medici remains an often misunderstood historical figure. Let's get into the actual events of her life and look at the person she really was. Beginning with her early life, Catherine de' Medici was born on the 13th of April, 1519, in Florence, to Lorenzo de' Medici, the Duke of Urbino, and Madeleine de la Torre d'Auvergne. Unfortunately, her parents died shortly after her birth, and she was raised by her aunt, Clarice de' Medici. The Medici family would end up being ousted by their rivals and driven from their traditional residence in 1527, and Catherine subsequently spent 3 years living in convents, trying to avoid persecution. Her exile ended in 1530, when her relative, Pope Clement VII, called her to Rome. Pope Clement VII later arranged her marriage to the French Prince Henry II in 1533, and she went to go and live at the French court. Catherine's marriage to Henry II was not a happy one. Henry wasn't interested in Catherine and spent most of his time with his mistresses, particularly the French noblewoman Diane de Poitiers. Catherine also had no political power or influence in the French court, and was queen only in name. After Henry II became heir in 1536 after his older brother's death, Catherine, recognizing the importance of bearing a male heir to continue the royal line, started trying folk remedies to try and increase her fertility. As part of this, she consorted with astrologers, folk healers, and even the physician Nostradamus, who would eventually become the chief physician during the reign of Charles IX, thanks to Catherine. She would finally deliver her first son, Francis II, in 1544, and went on to have 10 children, though not all of them would live to adulthood. These weren't the only children she raised, however. In 1548, Mary, the future Queen of Scots, came to the French court. Catherine helped raise her at the French court and helped her navigate the French court, and eventually even arranged her marriage to her son, Francis II. Speaking of Francis II, in 1559, King Henry II was killed from injuries sustained during a jousting tournament, and Francis II became king at the young age of 15. Catherine held all the real power, though, and exerted a great amount of influence over her son, to the point that the royal decrees were actually issued in both her and Francis's names, demonstrating the control she had over the French government. However, this wouldn't last forever. The Guise brothers, Francis and Charles, who were French noblemen that were part of the Guise family, tried to isolate Francis II from his trusted advisors. At this point, Catherine made a shrewd move and neutralized the threat they posed by inviting them to counsel her son. While this diminished some of her influence, she still remained extremely influential on the young king and had neutralized a significant threat. After the death of Henry II, though, religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants had begun to flare. This ultimately resulted in the Amboise Conspiracy, where in 1560, Protestants, including the Prince of Condé, Louis de Bourbon, attempted to kidnap Francis II in an effort to remove the Guise brothers' influence. However, this plot was uncovered and its participants were executed. Later that same year, Francis II died from an ear infection. His brother, Charles IX, became king, but the Guise brothers maintained their influence over the crown. However, in 1562, the Guise brother Francis ended up setting off the French wars of religion when he slaughtered a Protestant congregation in what became known as the Massacre of Vassy. Eventually, he was assassinated in 1563. Catherine used his death to assert more power over Charles IX and ended up reclaiming a lot of the influence she had lost to the Guise brothers. Using this influence, she tried to resolve the conflict in a couple of different ways. She made efforts to reconcile Protestants and Catholics, although they failed, and she also had Charles IX negotiate with the Ottoman Empire to relocate French Protestants after her efforts at reconciliation failed. The negotiations, unfortunately, also failed. This leads me to the discussion of possibly the most controversial event in Catherine's reign, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. In 1572, Catherine proposed a marriage between her daughter Margaret and the Protestant noble John d'Albret's son Henry of Navarre, who would later become Henry IV. There are claims that Catherine's proposal was part of a plot to lure prominent Protestants to Paris to execute them, but there is no evidence of this. John d'Albret did die of tuberculosis shortly after arriving in Paris for the wedding, and there are also unfounded rumors that Catherine poisoned her with a pair of gloves. However, these are also unfounded. What we do know is that after the wedding, an assassination attempt was made on another Protestant noble, Admiral Coligny, and the Protestants suspected the crown was involved. Fearing an attack, Catherine and Charles IX decided to act first and killed Coligny and other Protestant leaders. The king urged restraint after the killings, but the common people were incensed, and the massacre spread. People went around killing Protestants in cities across France, and it's estimated that over 25,000 died in the ensuing slaughter. While the event was awful, Catherine's role in it is not as notorious as it's made out to be, and it largely seems as if it came about as the result of poor choices and misunderstandings rather than any initial malicious intent. So this brings me to Catherine's last years. When Charles IX died in 1574, another one of Catherine's sons, Henry III, assumed the throne. However, during Henry III's reign, Catherine de' Medici's role and power over the French crown had begun to wane. While Henry initially took counsel from Catherine, he eventually began to establish his own independence and make his own decisions. One thing that illustrates this is the bitter power struggle he was engaged in the 1580s against the Guise family. In 1588, he ended up inviting the Guise family to a meeting where he assassinated the Duke of Guise, Henry I, and his uncle, against the advice of Catherine. This event ended up causing Catherine a great amount of distraught and may have actually contributed to her death. She died on January the 5th, 1589, possibly from pleurisy. Her legacy and reputation. The initial histories after Catherine's death, such as Jacques Auguste de Thou's 1604 Histoire Universelle, were positive, and depicted her as a queen who did her best to unite a country that was going through an extremely difficult time. However, later works such as the 1783 Histoire de François II by Madame Thoreau de Arconville were much more negative and painted her as a scheming queen who engaged in plots and conspiracies to try and maintain her hold over the crown. She's often been described as Machiavellian, although, as we shall see, she wasn't. In many ways, she was a product of her circumstances. Her actions were not out of line with with the actions of other contemporary monarchs in Europe, and she ultimately did her best to protect her own interests as well as that of her sons in France. She was not an evil queen. She just wanted to maintain her independence as she served her country. She led France through a very difficult time and made some bad decisions, but she is nowhere near the monster that history makes her out to be. Thank you. And here are my sources.